So we look at the chapter of the journeying or traveling abroad, and as I was telling you that travel in the 16th century was not permitted to everyone, particularly the lower classes. They could not travel, they were not given a license to travel. The villagers were supposed to be confined to their villages, practicing their particular crafts, and those who travelled, despite that, they were considered as criminals, and they were termed as vagabonds, and they would be punished if caught. So we see that here Raphael says that they have a wagon given them with a common bondman which driveth the oxen and taketh charge of them. But unless they have women in their company, they send home the wagon again as an impediment and a left. And though they carry nothing forth with them, yet in all their journey they lack nothing. For wheresoever they come, they be at home, and so on. If they tarry in a place longer than one day, then there every one of them falleth to his own occupation, and be very gently entertained of the workmen and companies of the same crafts. That is, people when travelling, even then they were not supposed to remain idle. And if they stay in some place for a few days, then they will work, they will practice their own craft there. If any be desirous to walk abroad into the fields or into the country that belongeth to the same city that he dwelleth in, obtaining the goodwill of his father and the consent of his wife, he is not prohibited. But into what part of the country soever he cometh, he hath no meat given him until he hath wrought out of his forenoon's task or dispatched so much work. That is, if somebody wants to venture a little, away and go to the woods or to some place far from his home in his own country, even there he cannot expect his lunch unless he does some work and satisfies the local community. Now you see how little liberty they have to loiter, how they can have no cloak or pretence to idleness. There be neither wine taverns, nor ale houses, nor stews, nor any occasion of vice or wickedness, no lurking corners, no places of wicked counsels or unlawful assemblies. You see, if we look at this from the viewpoint of 16th century Englishman, then travelling is associated with unlawful activities, lurking places, people playing dice or gambling at taverns, drinking and so on. But all these opportunities were not available to the utopians. Therefore, they didn't have any incentive for travel. And that travel is being looked upon as unnecessary loitering because it is a wastage of somebody's productive time. So during that time one should do his work which would be benefiting the community. This fashion and trade of life being used among the people, it cannot be chosen, but that they must of necessity have store and plenty of all things, and seeing they be all thereof partner equally, therefore can no man there be can be poor or needy. So since everybody shares the common product, therefore they have no lack of anything. But those cities that have given of their store to any other city that lacketh, requiring nothing again of the same city, do take such things as they lack of another city, to the which they gave nothing. So the whole island is as it were one family or household. So since goods could be brought from any city, therefore any goods which is lacking in a particular city, that is available in another city, and that can be taken from another city. Thus, basically the whole island being treated as one country, as one city, they do not have any lack of any goods, and therefore they do not need anything. They do not need to store anything or to hoard anything in huge amount, because everything is always available. And then, what are the different products that the utopians produce and they consume? A lot of material objects, material things are mentioned in this book, and it is an indication of the material culture of Renaissance England. The great interest in material objects that flourished with the development of trade, commerce, colonialism, and so on. So plenty of things or objects were available in England at that time. If you were aware of Descartes' play, The Shoemaker's Holiday, there we see reflection of this idea of the importance of material objects in the lives of the people. More mentions so many objects, so many commodities in this book that one may make a veritable thesis or write a thesis on the topic of material culture in Utopia. But when they have made sufficient provision of store for themselves, then of those things whereof they have abundance, they carry forth into other countries great plenty, as grain, honey, wool, flax, wood, madder, purple-dyed fells, wax, tallow, leather, and living beasts. And the seventh part of all these things they give frankly and freely to the poor of that country. The residue they sell at a reasonable and mean price. The excess product after consumption of their own city or their own country, the utopians take the excess product to another country, basically for selling it. But since they do not actually need money, so they sell it at a very low price, and 1/7 of the product they give away to the poor of that foreign country. So here we see the idea of charity also in this book, which we know that it was an idea propounded by the Roman Catholic Church, the belief in good works, the belief in charity. The Protestant Church did not believe in this. When the day of payment is come and expired, that is, other countries sometimes borrow money from Utopia. When the day of payment comes and expires, that is, the Utopians, they usually do not get back or take back the money lent. The city gathered up the debt of the private debtors and putted it into the common box, and so long had the use and profit of it until the Utopians, their creditors, demand it, which is very rare. More inclined towards frugality. Let me see. Adira commented, the Protestant Church was more inclined towards frugality and accumulation of wealth by an individual. Yes, I am answering this question, but before that I must tell you, since I disconnected my phone call, so I lost all your attendance. So please once again give your attendance so that I can copy paste it. Now, regarding this, the Protestant Church, they believed in the covenant of grace, as opposed to the Roman Catholic Church, which believed in the covenant of work. And the Protestants did emphasize on the value of work and frugality. Yes, that also you can say. But the idea of charity was associated with the medieval idea of indulgence. The Catholic Church sold indulgences so that the dead ancestors can get a place in heaven and so on. So this idea spread by the Catholic Church that if people did some good work, then they will gain a seat in heaven. That idea was criticized by the reformers who suggested that God did not look upon a good work or charity or any such thing that man can do. That is, man can do nothing to help his salvation. Salvation solely depended upon God's grace, and God's grace is arbitrary. It cannot be reasoned and judged by men. Basically the Calvinist belief and other reformers also believed in this kind of an idea. Therefore the Protestants disbelieved the notion of work, good work or charity. But since Sir Thomas More was a Roman Catholic, in his work we find an importance to charitable work. About Adira's point about the Protestants being leading to accumulation of wealth by individual, this is actually about the work ethics of the Protestants, on which there is a book by Veblen on the Protestant work ethics. It is believed that the Protestants, they emphasized on work ethics, that is industry, hard work, right? Work in the sense of hard work, not in the sense of charitable work for others. Is it clear, Adira? So the utopians, they never demand that their debts be paid back. So Adira has left again. Adira, could you hear my answer? All right. If not, perhaps you can listen to the recordings. So I am recording it, so you can listen it to it if you missed it.
Sir, Adira has written down in the chat box.
No, not predetermination. You mean predestination. Network is very bad here. That I can see. You are in and out. So you will listen to the recordings, then you can find what you missed. Yes, the Calvinists believed in predestination, but yes, that is linked to the idea of the covenant of grace. So who would be saved and who would be damned, that is predestined by God. Who will get God's grace and who will not. Therefore man can do nothing in this matter. Then the utopians do not take back most of the time anything that they loan to others, the money that they loan to others, which means that the concept of debt here is without the evil of usury, that is taking interest or earning interest by lending money. Usury is considered as a sin in Christianity. But if the case so stand that they must lend part of that money to another people, then they require their debt, or when they have war, for the which purpose only they keep at home all the treasure which they have, to be helped and secured by it, either in extreme jeopardies or in sudden dangers, but especially and chiefly to hire therewith, and that for unreasonable great wages, strange soldiers. For they had rather put strangers in jeopardy than their own countrymen. So utopians needed the money only in cases of emergency like a war, because a war is always expensive and one needs to hire soldiers. The utopians would hire foreigners as soldiers, not their own countrymen, because they would rather risk the lives of the foreigners than risk the life of their own countrymen. So we see certain, duplicities, we may say, or some kind of problematic values in this regard, that the foreigner or the slave, they are always considered as the other and they can be put into jeopardy or in danger, but not their own countrymen. So this kind of thinking is unacceptable according to modern ideas, but in most time I suppose it was too much to assume the universality of humankind, because even a good Christian would always look upon the other people who believed in other religions as evil, as bad, and therefore their lives could be risked, their lands could be grabbed, and so on and so forth. So the idea of tolerance of every religion was absent most of the 16th century and 17th century. So here we see two things. One is the idea of treasure or gold and silver, money, how the utopians find it useful only during war, and that too for not themselves but for paying foreign soldiers or paying others. That is one aspect. The second aspect is war itself. So Utopia was not a country that didn't go to war or that was against war. So there is a whole chapter on warfare later, so we'll look at it later in greater detail. So the conclusion from this discussion in this paragraph is, I mean in that they occupy not money themselves, but give it for that chance, which as it may happen, so it may be that it shall never come to pass. So the utopians are not concerned with money itself, but they keep it for some emergency or some chance event, and that chance event may happen, may not happen. Therefore the money may be useful, may not be useful in the future. Adira writes, this reminds me of how many Indian soldiers lost their lives for the British in the world wars. Yes, of course, yes. But this history of what I am going to say is that how Thomas More describes an ideal country, yet how that country or how that vision is still vitiated by some moral ethical problems of his own time, problems associated with colonialism, with the myopia of religion, with the intolerance of other faith. These problems Sir Thomas More could not overcome because he was himself part and parcel of that culture. So on one hand, when we compare Utopia to our modern times, we see that some measures taken in Utopia are very much modern. Some measures are even so much better than our own prevalent practices. On the other hand, we see that in some respects the utopian lag behind modern ideas of tolerance, universality and so on. Now we have the discussion on gold and silver, which is an important discussion in this work. how do utopians look at gold and silver, which are considered treasure in other countries? In the meantime, gold and silver, whereof money is made, they do so use, as none of them doth more esteem it than the very nature of the thing deserveth. And then who doth not plainly see how far it is under iron, as without the which a man can no better live than without fire and water. More in this book repeatedly refers to iron as a very precious metal which has sundry uses, and no civilization can exist without iron. And he describes that the utopians have most of the metals in their country, but they do not have iron. So for iron they have to get it from other countries, either through commerce or by fighting with them and defeating them and so on. On the other hand, gold and silver are the materials with which money was made at that time. But in themselves, gold and silver were not considered useful by the utopians, because these metals were very soft and ductile, and they were not, they could not be used for any hard work or any industrial work. So basically they were useless for development of industry. These metals were valuable in our belief that they are valuable because they are rare, or that they can be used as ornaments, jewelry and so on. But More here provides a very trenchant critique of the traditional way of thinking that gold and silver, they are precious, that they are valuable. From a utilitarian point of view, they are absolutely useless. So More describes here in Utopia people making their chamber pots with gold, or the shackles of the slaves, the chains with gold. In other words, gold is used for the most mean purposes in Utopia. And this reminds me of Milton's reference to Milton's discussion of the use of gold by Satan's army in building the Pandemonium, and how gold was considered very base, and the pavements of heaven were, made with gold. And that same material the angels, fallen angels, used to make the dome of Pandemonium, to make the roof of Pandemonium. So the worthless metal which was trod upon by people in heaven, that the fallen angels put upon their head, on their roof of their building. So it indicates an inversion of values. To remedy all these, they have found out a means which, as it is agreeable to all their other laws and customs, so it is from ours, where gold is so much set by and so diligently kept, very far discrepant and repugnant, and therefore incredible, but only to them that be wise. For whereas they eat and drink in earthen and glass vessels, which indeed be curiously and properly made, and yet be of very small value, of gold and silver they make commonly chamber pots and other vessels that serve the most vile uses, not only in their common halls, but in every man's private home. With the same metal they make great chains, fetters and gyves, wherein they tie their bondmen. Finally, whosoever for any offence be infamed, by their ears hang rings of gold, upon their fingers they wear rings of gold, and about their necks chains of gold, and in conclusion their heads be tied about with gold. So this strange custom of the utopians, that anybody who has done something infamous, a criminal, or somebody who has committed something very vile, very sinful, that person, as a mark of his shame, would wear rings of gold or earrings of gold or chains of gold and so on. So there we have this funny story of the foreign ambassadors who did not know the customs of Utopia and who came to this country, very much decorated in gold ornaments and precious jewels and so on. And people thought that these men must have committed something very sinful or wrong. So that is why they are decorated with gold and jewels. They gather also pearls by the seaside and diamonds and carbuncles upon certain rocks, and yet they seek not for them, but by chance finding them, they cut and polish them, and therewith they deck their young infants. So fine things, or jewels, diamonds, and things like that, precious stones, they do not have any use, excepting for decorating a person, which is childish from a utilitarian point of view. So Utopians, if they by chance find pearls or diamonds, they polish them and they decorate their infants with it. So no person who is old and mature would carry such things on him. Then he tells the story of the ambassadors who came to Amarot and how they were ridiculed, or how the children of Amarot thought that these ambassadors must have done something wrong. So the children told their mother, "Look, mother, how great a lover doth yet wear pearls and precious stones, as though he were a little child still." So such a big man wearing pearls and precious stones is ridiculous, because in Utopia only children wear that. But when the ambassadors had been there a day or two and saw so great abundance of gold so lightly esteemed, in no less reproach than it was with them in honor, and besides that more gold in the chains and gyves of one fugitive bondman than all the costly ornaments of them three were worth. So one slave had more gold and ornaments on him than the three ambassadors taken together. And especially when they had talked familiarly with the Utopians and had learned all their fashions and opinions. So then they realized that they have committed a mistake. Even when the fallen angels were excavating for gold, there was a metaphor of assault, of violation into the womb of the earth. Yes, very right, Adira. Milton describes the fallen angels wounding the hill, or digging into its womb, using this metaphor, suggesting not only physical violation, but also suggesting that nature is like our mother, and we have, you may say, an ecological message in this, message about the environment, that we should not, pry into things, dig into things, and go where we are not supposed to go. They marvel also that gold, which of the own nature is a thing so unprofitable, is now among all people in so high estimation, that man himself, by whom, and for the use of whom it is so much said by, is in much less estimation than the gold itself. So here is an inversion of values. Everything in this world is for man, but gold is considered more valuable than man himself. Then we come to a discussion of education in Utopia, which I suppose More would love to write, because he was himself a humanist and very much interested in education. These and such like opinions have they conceived partly by education being brought up in that commonwealth, whose laws and customs be far different from these kinds of folly, and partly by good literature and learning. For though there be not many in every city which be exempt and discharged of all other labours and appointed only to learning, that is to say, such in whom even from their very childhood they have perceived a singular forwardness, a fine wit and a mind apt to good learning, yet all in their childhood be instructed in learning. So again we see that even though learning was reserved for a few and all others were supposed to do manual labor, yet everybody in his childhood or her childhood would be given basic education. We know that the humanists were very much interested in school education, in education at a lower level, because since education begins at those levels, therefore unless one has a proper grounding in the arts, one cannot expect to be a good learner in the higher levels. So in Utopia, everybody got some basic education. And then the better part of the people, both men and women, throughout all their whole life do bestow on learning those spare hours which we said they have vacant from bodily labours. So everybody had some spare hours, and they were allowed to do whatever they wanted to do, particularly to cultivate their minds in those hours. And most people in Utopia would try to learn something or read something in those hours. Now, we find here a trenchant criticism of scholastic education, which is expected because, as we all know, that humanists were critical of scholastic education, and particularly scholastic logic, in which ironically the Englishmen excelled in the Middle Ages. Of all these philosophers whose names we hear famous in this part of the world to us unknown, to us known, before our coming thither not as much as the fame of any of them was come among them. And yet in music, logic, arithmetic and geometry they have found out in a manner all that our ancient philosophers have taught. So even though in Utopia people did not know about Western education and the great philosophers of the West, yet they have already mastered the sciences and the arts on their own. Music, logic, arithmetic, geometry. You see that these four belong to the quadrivium in medieval and Renaissance system of education. The trivium consisted of grammar, logic and rhetoric. In the quadrivium, arithmetic, music, astronomy and geometry. Here only astronomy is not there, but logic is included here in place of astronomy. But as they in all things be almost equal to our old ancient clerks, so our new logicians in subtle inventions have far passed and gone beyond them, for they have not devised one of all those rules of restrictions, amplifications and suppositions very wittily invented in their small logicals. So in the Middle Ages people studied those books of Aristotle and other logicians which were grouped together and called Parva Logicalia or small logicals. And these had theories of supposition, restriction and so on. Furthermore, they were never yet able to find out the second intentions, in so much that none of them all could ever see man himself in common, as they call him, though he be bigger than ever was any giant, and pointed to us, was even with our finger. So here More is referring to the medieval logician Duns Scotus. who invented the theory of second intentions. So it was an abstraction, and More suggests that the abstraction of a common man, like the second intention refers to the abstraction of a common man. And even if we are pointed by fingers to anybody as big as a giant, we will not see the common man, because it is not to be seen in reality, it is an abstraction. So the utopians, they did not have this kind of subtlety. Scholastic logicians were criticized by the humanists for their subtlety. But the utopians also had their knowledge of astronomy. But they be in the course of the stars and the movings of the heavenly spheres very expert and cunning. They have also wittily excogitated and devised instruments of diverse fashions, wherein is exactly comprehended and contained the movings and situations of the sun, the moon, and of all the other stars which appear in their horizon. But as for the amities and dissensions of the planets, and all that deceitful divination by the stars, they never as much as dreamed thereof. You see how interesting. More says that the utopians knew astronomy, which was a true science, but they knew nothing about astrology, in which the people in the Renaissance believed. They believed that events on this world are controlled by the stars and planets, by the influence of stars and planets, who have among themselves some kind of repulsion or attraction, some kind of contention at times, and so on. So the astrologers, they claim to know this science, and they claim that they can understand the tendencies of the stars and planets, and from that they can calculate what is going to happen in the future, that is, make some kind of a prophecy. So this in modern times we mostly think that astrology or making prophecy with the help of calculation of stars and planets is a pseudoscience. But in the Renaissance, most people believed in astrology and believed in prophecy, divination, as we have plenty of references in literature. Particularly on this topic of astrology, I remember how Shakespeare makes the Duke of Gloucester in King Lear speak about the influence of the stars. So Gloucester is represented in that play as a superstitious man, an old man. He is superstitious, and he believes in astrology. He believes in the evil influence of the eclipse and so on. So apart from these sciences, the utopians also knew very well moral philosophy. In that part of philosophy which entreated of manners and virtue, their reasons and opinions agree with ours. They dispute of the good qualities of the soul, of the body, and of fortune, and whether the name of goodness may be applied to all these, or only to the endowments and gifts of the soul. They reason of virtue and pleasure, but the chief and principal question is, in what thing to be it one or more, the felicity of man consisted. Now this will lead to a discussion particularly of Epicurean philosophy, which was one of the important philosophies in the Renaissance. Apart from skepticism and Stoicism, Epicureanism was the other classical philosophical tradition that influenced the Renaissance. Adira has commented, sir, even Julius Caesar comments that it is not the fault in his stars or something similar. Yes, of course. Julius Caesar, there also we see this comment on astrology. in Shakespeare we find repeated references to astrological predictions. Right, so we will look at the discussion of the theory of pleasure or Epicureanism, which was or which is mostly misunderstood, because the classical philosophy of Epicureanism was not what we understand by it today, that is hedonism or indulgence in pleasure, unrestricted indulgence in pleasure. That was not the classical Epicureanism, but this theory of pleasure or philosophy of pleasure actually suggested that people should have a very simple life with a very simple diet, because pleasure, it is suggested that pleasure consisted in good health and not in overindulgence. And we'll see that here we have a very long discourse on it. The Renaissance philosopher, Italian philosopher Lorenzo Valla, also had a book on Epicureanism.